What's up, you guys? Justin Rivas here. We're tackling some of the basics of making better videos in a very non-technical, hopefully very easy to understand way. We've talked about aperture, we've talked about white balance, we're talking about shutter speed next. Now, this probably isn't the thing you need to worry about the most when you're creating videos, but it is good to understand it, and especially if you're getting into full manual and, getting a little bit deeper into creating videos. It's important. In a lot of cases, you don't have to worry about it if you're just making simple YouTube videos, but as you're growing and becoming a filmmaker, it is important to understand. So let's just talk about shutter speed. What is it? Well, shutter speed is the speed at which the shutter on your camera opens and closes. Okay, very complicated stuff. But why it's important is because that shutter has to open to basically let the light in, which in the old school days would hit the film, and it would capture, and then it would close. And on digital, that open, the light's hitting the sensor, it's capturing the image, and it closes. Well, if you have a really slow shutter speed, let's say like a second, 1/1000 close, a lot can move in that time. Think about this, 1/1000 close. Well, what's going to happen to your image? Well, your image is going to be this blurry mess of my face moving because the whole time that's open, it's basically like printing whatever happens on the sensor. And so what you'll find is, for photography, if you've ever had this happen where you're taking pictures when it's really dark or you're inside, it's like everything's just a little bit blurry or maybe a lot blurry because that shutter on, especially like camera phones where they got such tiny little sensors, they have to stay open for so long to try and get enough light to actually take an image before they close. So what ends up happening is while they're open for a super long time, the image gets blurry. Now in the case of the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you're trying to kind of freeze the motion in sports or something where somebody's moving really, really quickly, you're going to have a crazy fast shutter speed. Could be 1/1000th of a second, which is just like so quick that it just opens and closes. Or I think, I have a picture here of a photo I took at, I think, 1/16,000th of a second, something crazy, and it's frozen all of the water droplets in the photo. That is a really, really fast shutter speed on the crazy end of the spectrum. Most of the time we live in between there, which, when you're taking photos, you want them to be sharp, meaning that everything is like in focus. My eyelashes aren't blurry, faces aren't blurry. You don't want blur when you're in photography, unless you're intentionally trying to show some motion, but typically blur is bad when it comes to photography. Video is very, very different because we actually want blur in our videos because it's actually normal for our human eyes when they see motion that it's a little bit blurry. For example, when I wave my hand here, you can see that my hand is actually blurry on your screen. It's not like individual. It just kind of blurs together and that looks like normal, natural motion. And we want that in video so that it looks and feels normal. And so if we set our shutter speed too high, what ends up happening is we end up getting this choppy motion of a hand waving that looks a little bit silly. If we get it too low, it actually messes up the video, and that's maybe a far more technical discussion. But basically what you need to know for shutter speed, if you're shooting, is there are rules around what your shutter speed should be based on how many frames per second you're shooting. Now, if you've never heard of frames per second, you have to set on your camera either typically 24 frames per second, which feels very like cinematic and film-like because that's what they have, is they actually have 24 individual frames on classic film for movies. And that's what our eyes are used to seeing in the movie theater. Every second there's 24 individual frames. And then we got into 30 frames per second, which is kind of like that, but a little bit smoother because we actually put 6 more frames in there. And then now you're seeing more and more 60 frames per second where they've actually got 60 individual frames per second in there. And that motion is very smooth, but it's almost weird because of how that motion looks. Now, all that to say, you get to pick based on what you are doing, whether you want to be 24 frames per second, a very cinematic look, 30 frames per second, which is a little bit smoother, but doesn't look as weird as 60 frames per second, and then 60 frames per second, which has its own unique feel. If you're just starting out, 30 frames per second is a great spot to start because it's kind of in between and it won't get in the way of doing anything. It's pretty good at low light. That's maybe another discussion, but 30 is a good place to start. If you're trying to make things more cinematic, do 24, and if you're weird, do 60. I don't know. There's other places for that. Anyway, you have to pick that and start there, and then there's some rules that apply to that, and it's basically you want to double the shutter speed based on your frame rate, which sounds horribly technical. Just look at this. See here? 24 frames per second you're shooting in, you want to be at 1/50th. 24 times 2 is 48, but you don't get 48, so you're basically doubling to the closest. If you're at 30 frames per second here, you want to be at 1/60th of a second. If you're at 60 frames per second here, you want to be at 1/125th. Now again, you would double this. Should be 1/20th, but your camera won't give you 1/20th. These will ensure that your motion looks natural and smooth. And if you want to follow the rules, just don't vary from this, and you will be absolutely fine. But this is where I come back to 99.9% of the world cannot tell the difference whether your shutter speed is too fast or not. Like we talk about the blur like this, but honestly, this is at 1/50th. If I went to 1/100th, you wouldn't even really be able to tell the difference. Like it would be so minor. And it's something typically that you just can't be adjusting all the time when you're filming simple videos. If you're creating a movie, sure, you need to be able to watch that. But for everyday video use, you typically don't really have to worry about this. The only thing is, again, where we talk about shutter being open and close, the longer it's open, the more light we get. Also, the more blur we get. But when it comes to video, if you're ever stuck in a really low light situation and you're like, I need to get more light because it's too dark, you can actually cut all of these numbers in half so that they basically match here, meaning 1/25th a second, 1/30th of a second, or 1/60th of a second, and your video will still be okay. It's a way to be able to cheat. And if it's too bright out, you can increase your shutter speed. If you can, try and keep it in the same multiples. Like if it's too bright out and you actually need to get less light, you could be at 1/100th of a second here, 1/125th, or 1/250th, and continue in multiples of that. But if you get off a little bit, it's fine. It's more important to have a properly exposed video, meaning that the video is the right brightness, not too dark, not too bright, than it is to nail your shutter speed. Okay? So shutter again is simply how long does it open, how long does it close? How long does it open, how long does it close? It matters a lot more in photography for varying that depending on what you're wanting to do. When it comes to video, you try and follow this rule, but honestly, if you're starting out, put it in aperture priority and let the camera handle the shutter speed, because you won't really need to worry about it. If you're starting to make films, then you set the aperture, you set the shutter speed, and you're going to set the ISO, which is another video that we're going to talk about. But when you're starting out, if you're struggling to know like what is frame rate, we've talked about it. Open, close. What should my frame rate be? In an ideal world, it should be this. If you have to break the rules, just try not to go, you should never go under. Meaning, if this is 24 frames per second, if you shoot at 1/20th, it's going to start to look bad. Or if you're at 30 frames per second, if you shoot under 1/30th of a second, it's going to look bad. Again, so on and so forth. Don't let it drop below this. As long as you stay up above it, you're going to be okay. You want to be double your frame rate if you can. And if you can't be, there's a little bit of wiggle room. But honestly, go out there, shoot it. Honestly, go shoot a video if you're really concerned about shutter speed and you're like, well, I don't want it to be wrong. I don't want it to look funny. Just go practice something. Shoot shutter speed and, shoot and just vary the shutter speed. Just drop it way down, bring it up. Drop it way down, bring it way up, and see what happens to the motion of it. The one caveat I will say is there are certain very fast-moving objects where you do want to be careful about your shutter speed. When I vlogged, 99% of the time, I never worried about shutter speed. It was always in aperture priority, and I just let the camera do the shutter because it's fine and it doesn't really matter for those kind of videos. But when you're looking at things like airplane propellers or running water, that really quick motion, when you end up getting this like jittery thing because your shutter speed's so high because it's so bright out, it ends up looking a little bit funny. And that's what you can see here. I'm just rolling a little bit of a video with the propeller, and you can see the difference where when it's nice and smooth and the propeller just looks like it's a blurry mess, which actually looks normal, that's when our shutter speed is nice and low and we're following closer to that double the frame rate. But when I have to crank that up really, 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 really high, that's where you end up seeing that it starts looking a little bit funny on that motion. So car wheels, water, propellers, anything that's moving like really, really fast, that's when you want to be able to watch out for it. But in everyday use, sure it matters, but it doesn't really matter. So don't get caught up into it unless you're getting into serious filmmaking. That's shutter speed. Hopefully that answers questions. Any comments, drop it below. Again, this is a video focused at people just getting started in the beginning channel. So if some of you hardcore guys are saying, it really does matter. Yes, it does matter once you get to a certain level, but when you're just starting out, it doesn't really matter. Okay, cool. I'm Justin Rivas, thanks for watching.